Great. Um, I want to start off by saying, thank you for everyone joining us. I'm going to introduce myself in Hinana Etit, our sacred language, and usually how we start things off is by invocation. And so I'll start by saying a short prayer. Behini sanana behen jih bi ne an hu usi hatinini jaba ani. Jabati Hinana Etit haticha and atik don it nahu saha. Basihi nete ina. Heath the teen and Nahabethan, it's good to see you all here. Hasesi Nichia na asit na hinana inana na hate Nichi hehet. Hello, my Arapaho name is Wind River. I'm Northern Arapaho. I'm from the Wind River Reservation. And we're all here with Youthfulness Soldier Wolf and Christie Wildcat, who are also Northern Arapaho. And I think it is imperative that when we're talking about water and land, that we hear from Indigenous peoples, listen to our perspectives, stories, and learn from our traditional and contemporary knowledge. I'm going to give some quick updates before we get started. Yesterday marked the 150th anniversary to the creation of Yellowstone, the world's first national park. And though it is exciting in the conservation community, the unsettling truth is that for the park to be created, the Indigenous people had to be forcibly removed. And there was a beautiful event yesterday held together by the Greater Yellowstone Coalition that talked about that history and that legacy and the impacts that it has to this day. So be sure to check out the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, because the conversation that happened yesterday was recorded, and there are more events that are happening throughout this year. I'd also like to mention that we are midway through the legislative session, and that there are some important bills that we would like to flag for you during this call while we have you. If you aren't familiar, in 2017, there was a bill that allowed sage grouse captive breeding, and it expires this year. But there is a bill called Senate File 61 that would allow captive breeding permanently in Wyoming. Now, we have specific laws that don't allow big game farms, and we should be concerned about game bird farms as well. This bill is still being heard on committee, and despite over 600 emails last week, it passed through the Senate. So we are asking that you contact your House reps and tell them to say no to Senate File 61. Now, we're here today to talk about energy extraction on Indigenous lands. And I think it is fitting that during this time that we're having this discussion, Mitsubishi, Bill Gates, and a handful of others are wanting to bring Natrium project to Wyoming. TerraPower and PacifiCorp have announced trying to build what they call an advanced nuclear reactor, a sodium fast reactor, at one of the 4 sites in Wyoming. And the 4 proposed sites are coal-fired power plants that are scheduled for retirement in the next few years. Now, down at the Capitol, there's a bill called House Bill 131, which would support skirting local and state mechanisms and would leave much of the decision-making to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is a federal agency. This leaves Wyomingites in the dark with no repository in the United States. Waste is stored on the sites, which would leave us with all the cleanup and the billionaires with all the profits. So contact your legislators and tell them no on House Bill 131. Wyoming Outdoor Council hosts a conservation cafeteria monthly, and this month it is our pleasure as the newly formed Indigenous Land Alliance of Wyoming to listen to Christie, who is going to present to us their research in relation to decision-making processes involving nuclear energy within the Wind River Reservation. She has interviewed tribal members on how energy decisions have been made historically and contemporarily, as well as observing business council meetings. Christie today will be sharing some of her research. Christie is an enrolled Northern Arapaho on her maternal side, and is also Cherokee on that side. As for her paternal side, she is Pawnee and Navajo. From the Wind River Reservation that is located in central Wyoming, but is currently in Laramie, Wyoming, where she is studying at the University of Wyoming as a second-year grad student. She is majoring in anthropology and minoring in Native American and Indigenous studies, and has a bachelor in Native American studies, anthropology, and political science. She has received her dual reverse associates from Central Wyoming College in anthropology. At the University of Wyoming, Christie Wildcat is a Rosemary Martha Spitaleri and Tobin Memorial recipient, plays for the club soccer team, runs track for the UW women's track and field team, is a part of Keepers of the Fire, and the first recipient for the Richard Baldes Biodiversity Award. Her career goals are to recover lost artifacts in cases across the globe, to become a curator at the American Indian National Museum. The goal is to preserve culture due to the culture dying out. She is currently serves as the founder of the Wind River All Action Crew, a McNair Scholar, Cobell Scholar, and serves as on the Youth Advisory Board for the Center of Native American Youth. And with that, I want to thank Christie for joining us today. It's good to see you here.
Thank you so much. Are we going to dive into this now?
No, I just wanted to introduce a couple things.
Just want to double check.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Well, I actually recently read this statistic that was pretty alarming, and it says that approximately 71% of tribes have reported that their traditional activities take place on or within close proximity to hazardous sites. And it goes on to explain that, however, that this might be true because us as tribal people, we value our traditions, we are more inadvertently likely to suffer from health risks associated to these sites because that doesn't keep us from participating in our ways. Yufina and I live in a community on the reservation in Arapaho, a mile or so from an old uranium mill, where in the 60s, sand ore was milled to make concentrated amounts of uranium called yellowcake. Fast forward 50 years after it being in operation, and our groundwater is still polluted by the tailings. Yufna, I was wondering if you could speak on the mill and its effects in our community.
So yes, hello everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Youthfulness Ogawa with the Wyoming Outdoor Council and also with the Indigenous Land Alliance. One of the things with conservation cafeterias, we're able to bring out issues that are important to Wyoming, and as citizens of the state of Wyoming, as tribal people, our voice is lost many of the times. And so the Indigenous Land Alliance, what we're doing is bringing those issues like today, and today's a really historical time for us because these issues haven't been brought to this platform. And so I'm really thankful for the Wyoming Outdoor Council to be able to have this conversation today. So in light of the UMTRA site here, that Big One is talking about, the history of it directly with my own family is when the allotments hit the reservation and every family got 80 to 180 acres. One of the family allotments there where this site is now today, it's a sulfuric acid plant. What had happened was the state had come in and claimed this land as eminent domain. And it just so happened that my father's maternal side had that allotment. And so the state came in and said, we want this land as an eminent domain. We looked everywhere because Cobell's land back program was saying, if you could prove that, your land was taken away, they would give you that amount back. And so while my father was still alive, that was his main push, was to talk about how that land was taken illegally, but also how it was never compensated even through Congress or anybody else. So we look for land deeds, we looked for receipts, we went everywhere, and we're able to not find any paper trail. And so over the years, as Big Wind pointed out, it became, a site where yellow cake was being produced. And I remember driving through there as a kid and being, I didn't know at that time, but like, wow, look, it's gold. But all this time, it's radioactive. And so over the years, they've taken those mill tailings out towards Jeffrey City. And my father kept telling them, my relatives who didn't want to be enrolled, who wanted to just be left alone and die quietly, were a part of that mill tailings. And so there was a cemetery there. And so everything Big Wind talked about earlier about how these places that are important to us just so happen to be contaminated is true in this instance. Because a lot of the time, my father would always say, be careful, be careful. We have a cemetery here, and it just so happened the yellow cake was put on top of that cemetery. And so as we go through history, we know that NEPA, Section 106, NAGPRA, none of those were a part of this. And especially for tribes, it's really hard to be able to have that narrative and to have that voice and that platform to say, there's rules we need to follow, there's regulations we need to follow for a reason. And I like how you said that, Big Wind, how a lot of the times how we go about how we live as tribal people, our traditional practices in our lives are a part of that. And, when it's contaminated or polluted, even with our own water today, you come to this part in our life where we're trying to figure out how do we balance having sustainable water, but also making sure it's not contaminated. So over the years of living here, we've seen where the pipes are breaking, we saw, times where the state and the tribes have not wanted any accountability and kind of stepped back and said, well, nobody wanted to accept any data. And I wanted to talk about that part because I thought it was important. There was a lady who did all of these reports, tying together how many people had cancer in this area. And a lot of the time that data was overlooked. It was never, nobody ever took responsibility for it. And it was just kind of, swept away. And so today, this platform we have is the ability to have that voice and to come back and talk about these issues. But historically, this area, it's contaminated. I think they said 150 years it would be contaminated. And so I think we're only in the first 75 years of that. So, just moving forward, I'm really glad to see that Big Wind and Christie are really wanting to, talk about these issues because it is important to us here on the Wind River Reservation. Thank you, Big Wind.
Yeah, thank you. And one question, that I have for you around this is, you were working for THPO when there was people doing other kind of measuring kind of what was happening, looking at those areas and seeing some of our traditional medicines still growing in these areas. And so can you kind of explain a couple of that? And I know that since we had that flood a couple years ago, that it's actually the uranium plume under us has expanded a couple acres.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what the THPO is, it's the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. And at that time, one of the things that we were talking about was being able to share data, right? Because on the reservation, we have no data, we have no reports. And if they are, they're limited to being able to be shared with the people that it actually impacts. And so as I was there at THPO, it was always like trying to get that information and to be able to share it in a way where we're all learning from it and trying to decide how do we go forward, how do we progress forward and make this a safer place for our community. And so at that time, a lot of the times they were trying to figure out, okay, what's still here? How do we move forward? There's many animal corridors that go through there. We see that all the time. We see moose migrating, we see deer migrating, we see mountain lions coming through here. It's really an isolated area, but we still see a lot of the times these animal corridors going through. And then the other part to that are the plants, are the medicinal plants, are the berries. And the oxbow to the south of us on the Little Wind River, that oxbow there was contaminated, and it's not too far from the school. And so that was one issue we had. But there are a lot of berries, there are a lot of, medicinal plants that still could be used. But for many of the times you cannot use any of that. And so what does it mean when we want to fish? What does it mean when we want to go out to these rivers that later, drain into Boysen Reservoir, that later, drain into all of these other tributaries? So that's one thing I grew up always knowing, was that, it's not safe to go there. There are other safe places we can go. And so when you talk about this area, it don't just impact, a 1 mile radius, it impacts this whole community. And we need to make sure that we're talking about it, and we're able to have those conversations, because it's important.
Thank you. And then I have a question for both of you, and I would like Youthfulness to start, and then you could follow, Christie. What is the importance of having free, prior, and informed consent when you're developing on ancestral lands or using resources from an Indigenous population's territory?
So that's a really good question, because one of the things when I was the TIPO was, and even before I was the TIPO, was first, prior, and consent is really important when you talk about any tribe, because all tribes have ancestral territory. All tribes claim an area that in states that we don't live in currently, and it impacts our lives today, because we still go back and we still pray, and we still have these connections to that land that very many people don't have today, but tribes do. And we have very important places today where, there's so many rules made up, so many other regulations made up to keep us out, but it's easy to mine, and it's easy to do all of these other things of extraction. And so when we look at these projects and we think about who's really in charge and who's really going to go forward and make those decisions, tribes need to have that first, prior consent. Because at the very beginning, if we're left out of those conversations, and this is why we pushed government to government consultation, was to say that, any tribe, no matter where, they may not live there now, have important connections to that land. And I'll let Christie, go ahead and have her response next. Thank you.
Thank you, Youthna. Speaking from my side, ethics is everything, especially when you're doing research. And so with ethics, that's just responsible research right there. I mean, just for interviews with my research, I had to get permission from both tribes, since I was working within just Wind River Reservation initially. But that just comes to show how important it is to get permission, to get that consent, especially within the tribal community. And like Youthna said, like we need this, especially if there's going to be development. I mean, from my developmental side, that my research is trying to explore, we need to be part of the conversation, because we've just gone through so many issues and barriers, especially when it comes to outsiders working either in just research alone, or corporations coming on to our reservation to extract our resources, or do whatever they got to do. But we need to be a part of this conversation, since they are working on our home, our ancestral lands, and overall it's just that ethical side of things that we need to focus on, especially when it comes to these big corporations or just these random outsiders who want to do research. Ethics is everything, and I cannot push that enough. Thank you.
Thank you both for answering that. And this next question goes to you, Christie. Hearing about your research, why do you think that rural communities are the ones that are proposed versus more affluent, more populated areas?
Yeah, with that, honestly, it's the same old worry of what about contamination, or what about this? And they think that with rural communities, oh, it's only going to affect so many people, or it'll affect them down the line, when that's not the case at all. And I think that's what the key is with this talk in general, and with my research, is to really show that you can't take for granted. Even if it is a rural community, we need to still pay attention to the people that are around there, especially when it comes to contamination or a meltdown or anything of that source, especially when you're dealing with natural resources around. I mean, water can flow for miles and miles. I mean, take a look at the Standing Rock issue. That goes forever and forever and forever, so on, so on. But that's the thing, is these big corporations or whoever wants to come in, could be some other type of business, but they just need to take a look at the people around, the land and all of that. Just because there's a less population doesn't mean they're less of an issue. There's going to be less issues. It's still going to be an issue overall of getting people sick or not pay attention to their health and their life quality. It's just all the same. And so I think that's what a lot of things slip through the cracks, just because there's that less population in rural areas rather than the urban areas and whatnot.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. It's, and I think for us as people who are from rural communities and the majority of reservations being in rural communities, that we are perceived that we lack the community power behind, standing up against these, situations. With that being said, I think it's perfect timing to jump into your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll go ahead and start sharing. Okay, are we good? Can everyone see that? Perfect. Real quick, I know I got an introduction, but Dos Nathana Nanana, Christie Wildcat Hinana Inana. Thank you for allowing me to talk about my work. It's really exciting, as this is one of the bigger first initial presentations I'll be able to do on this. And with that, it is my honor to present you the Engaging the Wind River Reservation Tribal Community in Environmental and Energy Decisions. With this, I would like to do a quick thank you to the Idaho National Labs Emerging Market Analysis and the Richard Valdez Native American Excellence Fund in Biodiversity Conservation for allowing me to do this research and for my funding, because it is a really important issue. Oh. Okay, so with this, I'll jump into it. Professor and author Tracy Lee Clark writes of how Indigenous people are able to serve the land, which makes them a suited role for being protectors of the land in a unique way. This comes to a specific substance and actions regarding nuclear energy and mining, a challenge that can occur when working with nuclear energy and mining as well, especially when it can lead to economic development. And it only becomes a challenge when aiming to preserve culture and traditions. Through nuclear energy and mining, this comes in comparison to traditions and culture preservation, as they are on the opposite ends of the spectrum. Both are crucial into Indigenous communities. Nuclear energy and mining can contribute to economic development. However, these actions can still pose a challenge to these communities due to their potential destruction of the land and sites that these communities hold sacred. Indigenous communities need to have a voice finding a balance between these two fields. INL specials in nuclear energy research, as they have approached different universities, the Wyoming University being one, to help them conduct emergent market analysis for micronuclear reactors in remote communities. These communities have large Indigenous populations, those who are dependent on diesel fuel and have lack access to other energy resources. So this research seeks to help understand how to engage these communities in energy decisions. The INL's project purpose is to provide information about empowered decision-making in rural communities about natural resource energy. So I will contribute my support to INL to help assist them in empowering that decision-making on these different factors when it comes to emerging technologies, and that will be included in the research as well. Due to the history and the lack of trust of outsiders, our work in the INL project wants to help understand how to properly engage and interact with these communities and show the importance and the better engagement with those in the Indigenous communities, especially in its energy decisions. The overall purpose of this research is to help get a full understanding of how decisions are made on Wind River Reservation. So with this, I'd like to expand on it. Like I said, the nuclear energy and mining can contribute to economic development, but there is the question of where would you do it and if that land will be affected negatively, especially when it comes to our sacred lands, especially that we hold dear to us. And so with that, we would do the historical analysis and modern research to go into this and to properly do research and to make sure that the voices of the Indigenous communities are being heard, especially with this outside research. So to address this purpose, and I will read you my research questions. How are decisions made in the Northern Arapaho tribe and the Eastern Shoshone on the Wind River Reservation? And is there a difference now in current days, current times, and pre-colonization or early reservation life? And with this, I'll go into a second question as well, is how do decisions occur regarding energy on the Wind River Reservation, specifically within these two tribes? So just a little bit of background context. A lot of you may already know this, so I just may be repeating it, but this is helpful for especially those who are unaware, or since I'm dealing with an outside research entity, it was important to include why it's so important to get permissions from both tribes. And so with that, I will go into my context and background. This project will be a collaborative and influenced community-based stakeholder engagement where the decision-making process of Wind River Reservation and the two tribes' processes will be analyzed. The historical current decision-making process regarding natural resources amongst the two tribes will be supported by literature review, analysis of decisions that are associated with the tribe's natural resources. The decision-making process typically involves a situation that is assessed by different stakeholders. Presumably, many outsiders believe that culture is not a part of the decision-making, but that is the issue. And so with that, cultural anthropologists will play a role in being the anchor within these communities to help influence the research question to be culturally aware, especially within this project. So the contextual background of the INL project is to assess the processes and question anthropological analysis in different anchor communities to which will be relevant and adapted in cultural contexts. The context of this project will also be defined as a community-based participatory research in which the research will be studying lost my place in the notes. Which will be studying one type of particular energy source, which is the nuclear in this case. The importance of understanding the host community will be another focus, a main focus. The historical and contemporary analysis of this overall structure of the community will be important, especially when dealing with the energy part of this research and to determine how exactly can we empower the Indigenous communities to really take a step into the decision-making processes when dealing with the outside industries. So this project plans to bring collaborative approaches, especially when it comes to decision-making in the Indigenous communities, and then focuses on a decision process, whether it's formal or informal. The project will then continue to outline the community-based participatory research for a future reference, especially when it comes to decision-making, implementation, and assessment of community interest. This project will not only contribute to this side project, but it will also serve as my thesis work, as it is my thesis work, just to help show the importance of collaboration when it comes to decision-making processes of tribal involvement, energy, and outside people, researchers, corporations coming into the reservation to deal with anything within reservation boundaries and tribal people. Though through research, the two tribes will be able to give their perspectives to where their voices will be heard, because it is important, and ethics is a strong foundation within this research. And when it comes to ethics, it's important to keep that in mind, especially with the collaboration and communication when it comes to nuclear power and dealing with it in home communities. So with this, the Wind River Reservation is used as a case study, since it is one of the chosen communities that INL was focusing on, and due to the two tribes being housed on the Wind River Reservation and the uranium mine, it was a perfect case study to help give a voice to and give a chance to have that historical analysis on this. So it provides a good example of a historical industrial site. As we talked about before, the uranium mill was operated on the east side of the Wind River Reservation near the communities of Arapaho and St. Stephen's. The mill provided uranium oxide while using an acid from alkaline mill circuits, and the sulfuric acid was also processed as well at this facility. Overall, this project will support the collaboration and ways of dealing with an Indigenous community that have suffered from the side effects of a energy resource in a negative way. So with this, a community member experiences are important, as they can provide both historical and current perspectives that have to deal with energy, industry, environmental compacts, and environmental issues or barriers that have happened to the community itself. So with this, I'll go over what is on my slide. The Wind River Reservation is the second largest reservation in landmass, where it is 2.2 million square acres. It is the only reservation that houses multiple tribes within the same reservation, but the history behind this is very complex, as it is a true ancestral lands to the Eastern Shoshone and the Northern Arapaho were removed to this land during the Removal Act of 1830. So now two tribes are housed there. But what was also important to focus on this is the fact that the structural layout of the two tribes are all based on council leadership rather than the chiefdom ways that were in the past. And since we were dealing on decision-making processes, it was important to include this, since I'd be dealing with how decision-making was then and now. And so I just decided to give a little background to that. If for those of you who are unaware, the two tribes have several council members. They're elected onto council in a democratic election, but the council usually has a chairman. Now we have the co-chairs now, so it shifts through time, but the chairman is also elected by the tribal people within the council, but the council is elected every 2 years, so it's like the typical democratic election. But some more background to the chiefdom and why it's important to focus on then and now is the tribes, they're both housed. And so there are two different ways of making decisions within the tribe. You have your Northern Arapaho making decisions for their tribe and the Eastern Shoshone making decisions for their tribe. But what's also important is there are two tribes housed in one area. So it's important to have them work together and make a decision that would affect the whole area as a whole community. And so that's another thing I had to take into account, and hence why I had to get permission from both tribes. And so moving on from that, I will dive into my literature review to show pretty much the topics that we're focusing on, and the historical analysis I had to do and all the gaps I had to fill. So moving on to the literature review, this is a chapter within my thesis that examines the literature about contexts within my whole thesis as a whole. It provides background on the ties and connection of anthropology and energy by discussing the overall mega topic of energy, as you can see, and how it can deal with Native Americans and how the indigenous communities have that strong tie within the environment themselves. But it's important to keep in mind the sovereignty and the decolonization and how we can take all of that and learn from it and use it to our advantage in resilience, especially when it comes to the historical trauma that we have dealt with, especially when it came to our environment, our homelands. And with that, I would like to end as the sovereignty as a mobilization, environmental justice and representation, just to show that we as Native people, we can definitely use all of this and use it to help us build as Native people, especially when it comes to energy and natural resources. And so I'll give a little brief view over that. Is my full thesis will cover the anthropological perspectives on nuclear energy in Native American communities. The questions and problems will be addressed as the impacts of processing and development of uranium close to tribes, since on the Wind River Reservation, we have dealt with that. But with these tribes, their intimate knowledge of the land, the uranium miners and corporations would utilize tribal members' knowledge. In some other case studies, I'm not aware about the Wind River, as I'm still working on my lit review and tying up loose ends. But with this, the mining so near indigenous communities and reservations and native lands, different health and census data show that communities close to uranium mining would show health effects, really bad health effects. And you can talk to people on the reservation who grew up near the uranium mill, can definitely attest to that. And so a part of this would also have to deal with legislations, as we have talked about before, especially with the TerraPower. It's important to keep in mind that data collection regarding toxic waste storage, the Radiation of Exposure Compensation Act, and Indian Health Service archival documents are really important to keep in mind, because of so many things that have fallen through the cracks. It's just really important because there's different case studies, there's different scenarios that I have read through my literature review that show that the Wind River Reservation isn't alone. It's happened in Navajo country. It's happened everywhere. And so it was really important in my lit review to cover that, as there's a lot of health effects that are going on due to uranium mill mining and due to the negative effects that could happen if nuclear energy could be moved onto the reservation or somewhere close. And so with that, I wanted to just hit on the contributions with my involvement in anthropology and my contributions to anthropology. So overall, I will utilize the methods of not only a historical analysis, but a cultural analysis, as well as culture is a big part of Indigenous people's lives. I mean, it's a big part in my life, and we have to preserve it at all costs, especially when dealing with energy, nuclear, something that could wipe out our people or our culture, as we've kept it so long and alive and thriving. But the goal of my work is to help make people relevant to research and research relevant to people, just due to the fact that they can affect one another. Research is important to learn, especially when you want to have development within your land, but people are also relevant to research, to keep in mind that they're people, they're humans. We need to take care of one another, and you can't just do it for the sake of research and not get any importance. So that's where ethics comes in once again, as ethics are important. And so with that, the methods in my research, I'm taking on ethnography, case study, archival research, and the Indigenous research paradigm. But with this, within my ethnography, I took on semi-structured interviews, and I've been attending different webinars. Unfortunately, due to some complications, I have not been able to attend any general council meetings yet, but that's what happens in research, and we'll work around it. But with semi-structured interviews, I interviewed tribal members from both tribes. I was able to get different members and ask questions of their experiences living at home near uranium mill, what their thoughts were, and just pretty much I was able to hear their stories on what their life has been, especially dealing with a nuclear energy, or their thoughts on it and what they hope for the future. And field notes from webinars. I've been attending webinars that have dealt with Indigenous peoples and dealing with nuclear energy as a whole broad spectrum, whether it be on the East Coast, the West Coast. It's just really been really eye-opening to see what others are dealing with. And so I was able to go back to my methods on a whole broad. I was able to do archival research. I'm currently in a seminar class where I'm dealing with archival research as a whole, especially focusing on decision-making in the chiefdom ways to add to that contextual background. But what I also really wanted to focus on within my methods is the Indigenous research paradigm. This is more of a new perspective when it comes to methods and research, as more Indigenous people are making a splash in research. But this is able to set boundaries and enable researchers from non-Indigenous background to ethically continue their research and be involved when dealing with Indigenous communities. But additionally, it can create new relationships with non-Indigenous researchers to help understand and support the build of connection between the two groups of the researcher outside and the Indigenous community. But also it helps support the Indigenous researcher be from the outsider perspective, but also utilize the inside perspective when it comes to research, as they can get that closer connection to the people of the Indigenous community. So just a little quick update. I'm currently almost done with my data collection, and I'll be moving on to my analysis here shortly. But I will fully finish writing up my thesis, and I will defend my thesis either later this spring or early summer. Once I defend, I will officially graduate with my master's in anthropology, the minor in Native American Indigenous studies. And so with this has just been a full 2-year project, and put so many hours in, but I love it every second. As you can see, I broke down, if you're curious, how I started with INL and presented this as my first year project. And slowly from going to the INL project support, I changed this into my full thesis to help, give full research to help show that decision-making processes within a culturally rich community within Indigenous communities is so important, that we need to keep thriving for this. But yeah, you can see the rest that I've covered to finish writing and defend. And so what I've learned so far is that the health effects from a uranium mill still continue today. It's a big problem, and something needs to be done about it. And hopefully this research can help show that there needs to be action done. But unfortunately, there are still tribal members who are unaware or not sufficiently participated to energy decisions within the Wind River Reservation. And there's a lot more to that, something that we can probably work on or think about solutions to help solve that issue. But most of all, the processes of colonialism have dramatically impacted historical decisions, especially when it comes to the decision-making process and how it's changed within the communities that I have been reading about. And I have plenty more to say about that. But with this, the overall focus I really wanted to hit on is that outside companies, organizations, researchers, they all need to be more responsible for being more effective in their engagement with communities, whether it be Indigenous communities, just rural communities. They just need to have more accountability when it comes to their ethical research. If they have ethical research, permissions need to be sought for, voices, all of that need to be sought for. I mean, it makes for a good, responsible research, and that way you can get all the information you need without, you know, being overstepping. And with that, I just want to say this project contributes to the idea of importance of communication when it comes to making decisions, especially within an Indigenous community. The Indigenous community should have more of a say in engagement, especially when it comes to the energy resources. The Northern Arapaho tribe, Eastern Shoshone tribe, and the Wind River Reservation will be utilized as a case study in my overall thesis, and hopefully this can do an impact, especially when it comes to future resources or natural resource and energy resource work. And there's all my references, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. You know, talking about your thesis, it's based around tribal energy autonomy, how we make decisions, particularly around nuclear energy. And I think it's interesting because now more than ever, our self-determination has allowed us to build our sovereignty. What do you think is the most fascinating thing that you found about your research?
Honestly, everything I found fascinating happened to be within my interviews. I did interview a few of tribal elders from both tribes, and everything that they would say, they would always mention the youth. We need to do something for the youth. And with that, they just kept on mentioning the 7 generations. And so to me, that was so interesting that we need to make a change to make something better for the future. The need for preservation. Every tribal elder that I interviewed would always suggest interview this other tribal member because they'll be gone here soon and we need to get that information before they leave. And so that key idea of preservation and just thinking of future, thinking ahead, what was so interesting about was just stuck out to me because they weren't focused on the now. They weren't focused about make it better now, just work on it so it can be better in the future. And that's just something that really stuck out to me in my research. Out of all things, nuclear energy preservation was something that really kept on coming up. Same with sovereignty. We can always say sovereignty is always and will be there.
Yeah, for sure. I think that that's really what's really important is, you know, you talk about the research that you've done and it shows I think it shows a picture that historically we haven't been involved in a lot of this process making, and in fact, it was forced upon us. And now we're in the day and age where we need to be consulted, and we're creating that culture to this day where that's a necessity at this point. The next question I have is to talk about this project TerraPower, which is essentially would switch the old coal power plant to a nuclear power plant within the next several years. And I know people were touching on it in the comment section, so I just wanted to bring it up. They did decide which they selected which coal power plant that they would utilize, and the one that selected was Kemmer, on the other side of the Wind River Mountains near the Utah-Wyoming border. And so I wanted to ask both of you this, and I would like to start off with you, Christie. What are your concerns around a project like this?
Yeah, of course. And my thesis chair is here. She's been working on that project. So thank goodness to you and her, I was able to read up on it. So if I have any questions, I'll defer them to her about background. But my concerns overall is every other person's concern, especially when it comes to nuclear energy, is the possible issue of contamination. And because we don't know how contamination, how far it'll go. Because, nuclear, I would want to say nuclear energy is still fairly new if you think about it in terms of resources. So there still can be effects that we don't know about. But yeah, just contamination in general. It's a scary thought, like nuclear it scares me to think about it, especially being in my home state. Like, sure, it's so many miles away, but we don't know what can happen. A more serious case of contamination can happen. But yeah, that's my overall fear, and the uphold of legislations to help protect the people within the state. That's another issue that kind of scares me. What if we don't know what the legislators are thinking? If they'll be willing to back the people within the state and their concerns. And so that's just another thing that scares me.
Yufna, do you have a response to this?
Sure, yeah. So I always go back to not in my backyard, right? And the other thing is really thinking about when we talk about that location and we talk about landscapes and we talk about ancestral ties and we talk about those current projects that are currently within the Jonah field that are already contaminating almost that same location. It really makes me concerned because the preservation of Wyoming is really just being bought in right now. And even as tribes and as citizens of the state, we as much as we want to voice our concerns, they're always, muted or put to the back. And a lot of the big companies are seemingly starting to buy out Wyoming and preserving of our wildlife, our plants, our animals, our star knowledge, all of these various things through traditional ecological knowledge that we carry are going to be gone. And not just our history is going to be wiped out as tribes, but also the history of the citizens of Wyoming, because a lot of that historical trails have gone through there. So yeah, I'm concerned, and I'm kind of going back to what Christie said. It really kind of goes back to our legislators, and deciding what that looks like for our future is going to really be determined. And I'm hoping citizens and tribal members get to have that voice at some point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Christie, after the research you have done, what is your stance on nuclear and how it relates to generating energy? And where do you think we are as a community?
I have a better understanding of nuclear energy for sure, especially doing this project, because I'll be honest with you, when I was coming into this, I had no idea. And so even though I do have a better understanding of nuclear, like I said, it still kind of freaks me out because it can lead to so many things. Yes, it does lead to, more bigger, efficient energy, but at the same time, what is it going to do to our environment, to our earth? Our environment, we have to still take care of our environment and pay attention to it, because if we don't, we're just gonna be wiped out, every single one of us. And so with nuclear, I gotta say, yeah, like I said, it scares me. I mean, we really have to take care of our environment. But as my stance on it, I would say, okay, let's just keep an eye on it. But at the same time, let's not put all of our eggs in one basket. I mean, we still have natural resources such as wind, water, especially as a Native person, as an Indigenous person, we have Mother Earth. She'll take care of us if we take care of her. And we have lived that life for so many years, especially before colonization and before nuclear was even a thing. And so for me, I would honestly, I like the natural resources. But in terms of generating energy, since populations have definitely grown over the years and we're growing quickly as a human population in general, I mean, it can support what we need, but at the same time, it can definitely have the negative effects, of nuclear meltdowns, or everyone's so scarred about Chernobyl with the radiation, and that was nuclear power. I mean, it's just such a big concept in our contemporary modern day. I mean, take a look, it's on Simpsons, but at the same time, it's a joke there. I think it's something we need to take serious and actually read up on and get educated on. But where we are as a community, I think we can definitely do more on the energy side. I know it takes a lot of money to start up, especially like solar power or wind power, but in the end, I think it's something that we can definitely think about as tribal people, because it is a cleaner energy and we can definitely thrive off of that. But like I said, it's a lot of financial things. We all want it, but at the end, like, how can we start it? And so we have the potential. I'll say that we definitely have the potential, and we just need the little push to do it.
Yeah. Well, I really want to thank you for presenting to us and all of these questions. I wanted to kind of bring up this book, Breaking Iron Bonds, by Marjane Ambler. And it's about Indian control of energy development. And I think if you are, a non-Indigenous person who's wondering how they can become more educated on the subject, I'd recommend this book, highly recommend this book. And I'm going to read a small part from it, because I think that it is really, really important to get how we come from as Indigenous people. It says, Indian people have been bound by 3 chains: paternalism, exploitation, and dependency. These chains gained their crippling power through the decades as lawmakers facilitated on whether tribes should continue to exist as sovereign powers or whether their separate rights should be terminated. Many of those who advocated, quote unquote, freeing the Indian, though through that period were well-meaning, were paternalistic. Others were merely greedy and wanted to exploit Indian resources. Whatever their motives, the effects of facilitating policies were the same. The tribes and the individual Indians lost more and more land and other resources needed to make them self-sufficient again. This exploitation left them increasingly dependent on the federal government, and yet ironically resistant to change, because so often in change brought disaster. The constant conundrum throughout the history of Indian affairs in this country has been finding a balance between dependency and independence, trust protection and self-determination, autocratic federal control and tribal control. A tribe will have reached self-sufficiency when it can provide the needs to its community and determine its social and economic goals without violating its cultural heritage. And I think that this book gives a really good explanation of not only our reservation, but multiple reservations, and actually has pictures and stories from tribal members on our reservation. And it was actually, Marjane Ambler lives in Atlantic City. So they're a local Wyoming author. I picked this up at the Lander Library, so I know that there's a lot of copies. And with that being said, I just wanted to thank you all for joining us on this month's Conservation Cafeteria, and to remember to contact your local representatives to say no to the sage grouse captive breeding program. And then the support bill, House Bill 131, that would limit our voices as Wyomingites and tribal citizens alike around nuclear power in Wyoming.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, and you too.
Have a great day.
Thank you so much. Thank you.